far away.
This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News 9, English news as it should be.
A very good morning. You're watching News 9. I'm Karthik Malhotra. Over the next 1 hour, we'll put the focus on what the flare-up in West Asia means for the Indian economy. But first up, let's bring you all the headlines that developed overnight in the war in West Asia. United States Department of State warns Americans to leave West Asia immediately as escalating US-Iran conflict shuts airports, disrupts embassies and raises fears of wider regional war, with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying harder strikes are yet to come. US President Donald Trump says America will retaliate soon after 2 suspected Iranian drone strikes US embassy in Riyadh. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Washington is not planning any ground forces in Iran, but adds President Trump retains that option as administration pursues its objectives. Rubio also says the US hopes the Iranian people can topple their government, but stresses America's mission is to eliminate Iran's ballistic missile capacity. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says military operations against Iran will not become an endless war, though officials acknowledge the campaign could take time. In developments yesterday, Saudi Aramco shuts the Ras Tanura refinery after Iranian drone attack near Daman. Saudi forces intercept aircraft. No casualties reported as regional tension threaten global oil supplies. Back home, the Indian government moves to shield supply chain as West Asia tensions disrupt trade routes, pledges uninterrupted energy imports and steps up diversification amid oil price surge. Prime Minister Narendra Modi expresses deep concern over West Asia crisis, backs dialogue and diplomacy, says India working with nations to ensure safety of citizens in the region. And Indigo to operate 10 special relief flights from Jeddah to India for stranded passengers amid Gulf airspace disruptions, while Air India Express resumes Muscat services as Aviation Ministry monitors the West Asia crisis. The Israel and the United States launched military campaign against Iran could last several weeks and possibly longer, says US President Donald Trump. Now, Tehran's retaliation across US infrastructure and energy producers in West Asia are raising fears of wider regional instability. The intensity of the strikes, the killing of Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the absence of a clear diplomatic exit plan have heightened fears of what could become a prolonged and dangerous conflict. The US State Department on Monday urged Americans across West Asia to depart as soon as possible using all available transportation, though many airports around the region remain closed as airstrikes persist. Iran's counter-strikes have caused disruptions at US embassies and consulates throughout the region. The US embassy in Bahrain is closed. In Kuwait, Americans have been told to stay indoors. In Jordan, diplomatic staff was temporarily evacuated on Monday over a threat. Now, Americans had been told to shelter in place until further notice as Iran retaliates across the region in response to the US-Israel attack. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio too cautioned that the hardest hits are yet to come, saying the next phase of US military action would be even more punishing for Iran. Now remember, safe havens like Dubai have come under incoming fire. Hundreds of thousands of airline passengers remain stranded globally as airspace closures ripple across regions. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump warned that his attack on Iran could extend longer than a month as the war spread Tuesday, with Israel bombarding Lebanon and Tehran targeting US allies in the Gulf, including drones hitting the US embassy in Saudi Arabia. Now, shortly after the United States urged Americans to flee all West Asian nations, smoke rose above the US embassy in Riyadh after it was hit by 2 drones, although there were no immediate reports of injuries. Saudi officials say the strike caused a small fire and minor damage. The embassy issued a shelter-in-place advisory for U.S. citizens in Riyadh, Jeddah and Dhahran. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump said Washington will respond soon to the embassy strike. Trump also said that the war, which began Saturday with a strike that killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was going substantially ahead of schedule, but that the United States was equipped for a prolonged conflict. Donald Trump also, for the first time, clearly laid out objectives, destroying Iran's missiles being the first, followed by destroying Iran's navy, then the nuclear program, and finally stopping its support for armed militia groups across the region. The goal, notably, did not include toppling the Islamic Republic. Listen in.
An Iranian regime armed with long-range missiles and nuclear weapons would be an intolerable threat to the Middle East, but also to the American people, our country itself. They're never going to have a nuclear weapon. They were on the road to getting one legitimately through a deal that was signed foolishly by our country. And finally, we're ensuring that the Iranian regime cannot continue to arm, fund, and direct terrorist armies outside of their borders.
Remember, on Monday, Saudi Arabia energy giant Saudi Aramco shut down its Ras Tanura oil refinery on its east coast of the Persian Gulf near Dammam after it was targeted by an Iranian Shahed 136 drone. Now, Saudi state television, citing an official source, said the move was purely precautionary and confirmed there were no casualties from the incident. Now, earlier in the day yesterday, the Defense Ministry said drones had attacked the Ras Tanura facility, but Saudi forces successfully intercepted and downed the incoming aircraft. A military spokesperson confirmed the development through the state-run Saudi press agency. Remember, Ras Tanura is one of the kingdom's key energy facilities with a refining capacity of more than 500,000 barrels of crude oil per day, making the attack crucial amid already heightened regional tensions. Now, this, coupled with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, is adding pressure on global oil prices and threatened to impact India as well. That depends on more than half of its oil imports passing through the now closed Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, the Indian government is moving swiftly to protect the country's supply chains as rising West Asia tensions threaten vital trade routes. Officials say steps will be taken to safeguard exports and ensure uninterrupted imports of essential items like energy, fertilizers and edible oils from all available sources, including Russia, so that domestic consumers don't face shortages. Now, India's vulnerability arises from heavy dependence on West Asia, which is about 55% of its energy imports coming through the region, now affected by Iranian strikes and disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz. Now, shipping routes remain under pressure as well, and alternate pathways, such as through the Red Sea, are also seen as risky due to attacks by Yemen's Houthis. Officials say refiners are likely to boost purchases from safer regions, and if the conflict drags on, India could further diversify crude and LNG imports from countries like the US, Venezuela as well as Russia. Now, remember, India is one of the world's largest oil consumers but produces only a fraction domestically, importing more than 88% of the crude it processes. Higher global oil prices following the conflict have already been felt. The Petroleum Ministry reviewed supply conditions for crude, LPG and other products on Monday, with senior officials and state oil firms saying it is cautiously monitoring the situation and will take all necessary steps to ensure availability and affordability for Indian consumers. Meanwhile, the Commerce Ministry convened an interdepartmental meeting with exporters, logistics operators, customs and other stakeholders to assess shipping routes changes and prepare to minimize trade disruptions. The government officials reiterated that protecting continuity in export-import logistics remains a priority, with coordinated efforts to shield exporters, especially MSMEs, while keeping essential imports flowing in. Of course, India's oil economics go well beyond the price of petrol alone. Its ramifications could cast a dark shadow on the economy as a whole as logistics costs increase, shipping routes get longer, exports get expensive, and cost to consumers also increase. Let's put all this into perspective with Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, author and contributing editor at the Business Standard, and Barnik Chitran Mehta, PE investor, managing partner, Chrysalis Equity, who join us this morning. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. Shubhamoy, to you first. JP Morgan estimates that crude oil could climb to as high as $120 a barrel. That's almost double of what the prices were until just last week. What happens to India's economy in that scenario?
So, you know, what happens is that we should, the JP Morgan estimate or other estimates, these are supposed to be what's called the worst case estimates.
Right.
What happens when everything goes wrong. So we should be estimating that the price would be something like $120 as in the normal course. That's when every other option, the escalation is at that level, which is like beyond, when no bets are offered. So we shouldn't be talking about that. Currently, when you look at the prices in the global markets, prices haven't really been moving very sharply, because even now, dealers expect that the prices would be more or less range bound. This is going to be a short conflict. What happens is that there is a general escalation of price rises, because as you were just saying, that a lot of the movement could pass through the longer South Cape of Good Hope the region, that is basically the South African turn.
Right.
And that increases the cost generally for our imports.
That's right.
So yes, it will be. But if you ask that whether retail price at the bunks will be rising for consumers, which is the basic question, I don't think it's going to rise right now. And in fact, I'm very sure the government will ensure that this doesn't happen, because this is the implication of this is extremely difficult. Given the geopolitical situation, given the fact that it's going to be read very badly by the consumers,
right.
I'm not looking at a rise at the retail price, but oil companies, right from IOC to RIL, all of them will have to therefore take in the shock of the higher crude prices that will be coming in.
Right, because they also, Shubhamoy, if you remember, have enough cushion, because when oil prices fell down sharply, the price reduction wasn't passed to the consumers. But we'll revisit that in just a bit. Barnik, meanwhile, India revisiting Russian oil imports as an option, even though there was always ambiguity on whether India even stopped importing Russian crude in the first place ever. So while it keeps supply stable, does it send a mixed signal to India vaguely picking Israel's side in the West Asia conflict?
No, I think staying away from the politics, I think India will do the right thing to actually diversify its food basket away from dependence on West Asia. As you mentioned, more than 50% of our crude oil imports actually flows through the Straits of Hormuz, right? So diversification of our oil basket is natural, and I think will not be viewed too disfavorably by any of our partners, particularly the US, right? Though I would say that while $120 seems a little bit way off, I think $80 to $90 is a near-term scenario. I think Brent is already $80 plus, and this is only 2 days after the war, where it seems that the war is going to at least prolong for a few weeks, if not months, right? I think the implications on India are broader than just the petrol pump prices, which the government will try its best to shield. I think with the increase of freight costs and everything, remember, every $10 to $12 increase in crude oil prices actually increases India's current account deficit by roughly 0.3 to 0.4%, right?
Yeah.
So I think the implications of a conflict going significantly beyond 2-3 months has implications for our current account deficit, has implications for our rupee, because capital markets will ensure that a lot of FIIs are already beginning to pull money out. So that puts pressure on the rupee, which double whammy. So again, while there is nothing to be overly concerned about right now, but if this continues to be a high-grade conflict beyond 2-3 months, I think there are severe downside scenarios for the Indian economy, which the policymakers should start planning for.
Okay, so Shubhamoy, how long is India's runway? Because like we were just discussing, India did not really cut down on petrol pump prices and prices per liter of petrol and diesel when prices globally cooled off. But, and that cushion continues to be available with the oil marketing companies as well as with the government. But how long can India actually sustain? Because also, like Barnik mentioned, there is pressure on the Indian rupee. And every $10 increase in the price of barrels of crude is going to impact the Indian economy negatively. So overall, how long does India really have before it really has to get into the action mode and take corrective measures to ensure that the Indian economy stays on track?
Paradoxically, what you'll find is that as the conflict stays on, and this conflict, I do fully agree that it's not going to stay very short term, because even if supposing there's a regime change in Iran and USA feels that it has achieved what it wanted to do, the point that will happen is that there will be lone wolf attacks and all sorts of things. And so the global energy security architecture is definitely has changed drastically. You will not have situation where the US can say that there'll be no attack on the US soil or something. There'll be all sorts of things for years to come. And that those have major implications. But for the short-term thing, what you're asking about, what happens to India's import of a range of goods. First of all, imports, freight tankers definitely go up. But at the same time, what you remember for Middle East, the fact that if oil gets disrupted, if oil supplies get disrupted, if oil exports get disrupted, that's also a problem for them as much as it's a problem for India to import the oil. So they will definitely be making every effort to serve a very major market like India as smoothly as possible despite the conflict.
All right.
Which means that the countries will be looking with India to escalate pressure on the US government to cut down the risk to the movement across the Arabian Sea, across the very vital link which takes the Indian Ocean takes about 40% of the world's global oil trade.
Right.
So all of that definitely they will be trying to say that, look, we can't have a situation where India and China, both the world's two largest oil markets, are not getting oil, because that then creates problems for these countries in terms of their ability to handle their own finances. So that's much more, that's as big a threat. So you're going to see a very major movement happening on that side politically from these countries to ensure that this doesn't become a major blowout.
All right. And what about Barnik, India's exports? Because again, with longer shipping routes, with higher risk premium, India's exports, especially the MSME exports, to countries like the UK or even the entire European Union, even that gets impacted, doesn't it? So the timing of India stitching up those trade deals with EU and UK, now this West Asia flare-up, a big bummer, would you call it, for India's exports?
So I think the impact of that, is only will be felt if the conflict is prolonged beyond 6 months.
Okay.
I think the implications is that if you remember, the Indian government is trying to create a India, Middle East, Europe trade corridor, right, which uses logistics through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea.
Right.
I think there are implications for that, but in the short term, if you look at exporters, other than immediate exports to the Middle East, like basmati rice, maybe some IT services which will get impacted. I don't see any short-term impact. Anyway, the trade deals, the European trade deal will still take 3 to 6 months to get fully inked. I think hopefully if the conflict doesn't last beyond 6 months, I don't expect an impact. But if the conflict lasts beyond 6 months and it continues to be a high-grade conflict, again, there can be two kinds of conflict. There can be low-grade conflict where there is a simmering conflict which has happened with, for example, the Iraq war, or nearly the last 10 years of that war. But if it continues to be a high-grade conflict, I think policymakers in India have to reconfigure the calculus of the Indian economy to look at lower growth scenarios, higher inflation scenarios, and more importantly, rethink again the fiscal deficit management, which will come under stress. But again, no big implications unless the conflict goes beyond 3 to 6 months, which I think is the hope everyone has as of now.
All right, 3 to 6 months. But Shubhamoy, let's pivot away from India and broaden the canvas and really include China here, because there are conspiracy theories which are saying that the war serves a larger goal of the US deep state's ultimate objective of weakening China's influence and hence China's economy as well. How does a weaker Iran impact China, especially now that its interests in Venezuela and Panama Canal are already hurt by the US?
That's actually a very major point. That in the 3 months of 2026, we have seen one by one U.S. actions, and each of those actions have got directed against China's interest. So you would definitely see China taking very serious action, and that doesn't mean military action, but economic action to ensure that its interests are protected, which I think means that the deal between USA and China in April, that when President Trump is supposed to go to China, is definitely under threat. China will not take kindly to the fact that all its security questions are being made difficult by USA, as you rightly say. And this is going to mean that China will definitely up the ante on rare earths, on other exports, and even on semiconductor race, which is happening with the USA. All of these things, you would see a very, very huge flare up in global tension. Okay. So definitely, there is going to be. I mean, I expect that in the summer months, the U.S.-China standoff will be thickened as a result of the war in the Middle East. Also, remember that the Middle East, lots of these countries, especially Iran, had been looking at China as a counterweight. So for China to just stand around and not take any steps is going to be tremendously difficult for China's overall larger goal of being the alternate security provider in that region. So yes, I do expect that in a Chinese way, where that doesn't mean militarily, but it definitely does make it very difficult to expect a US-China Tatan. In fact, something on Taiwan could emerge out of this thing, and that right. Could mean extremely difficult situation for the global, because more than Iran, the small country of Taiwan holds much more economic significance.
Of course, no doubt about that. But Barnik, some also believe that China will perhaps come out absolutely unscathed and may actually end up becoming the ultimate beneficiary of any fallout in West Asia. Any merit to that argument, or do you concur with what Shubhamoy's analysis is?
I subscribe to the opposite view.
Okay.
I think if you look at China and their incredibly long-term thinking, it is in their long-term interest to have a stable Middle East without presence of pernicious bad actors like the erstwhile Iranian regime, right? While this war causes short-term pain for big oil importing nations like India and China, in the long term, if the outcome is far more stability in the Middle East and stability across Iran and other countries, it benefits China in the long term. In fact, if you look at carefully what's coming out of the US State Department, I think there is an understanding and maybe some backdoor communications and discussions with the Chinese to not aggravate existing situations, because in the long term, a stable Middle East with the absence of any troublemaking elements is better for China in the long term. So again, I wouldn't read too much into China playing too much adventurism, at least in the next 3 to 6 months. I think they will also cautiously adopt a wait and watch posture. I think what's incredibly remarkable is that the way the Iranians have responded to the conflict by attacking other Gulf states has actually also isolated them significantly. And the possibility that China uses this to their advantage will be viewed very negatively by not only the Americans, but the overall world community. So I would believe the Chinese would be far more sensible and cautious. And in the long term, it serves their interests far more than the interests of the Russians, for example, who always wanted instability in the Middle East because it increases their importance. So in general, I don't see a big China angle there. unless the conflict prolongs beyond 6 months and there is significant disruption to global oil supply, if at the end of 6 9 months we get a situation which is far more stable and far more, I would say, with a more globally palatable Iranian administration in place, I think that's a end case scenario which the Chinese would welcome because it protects their interests in the long term.
Okay, but Shubhaboy, regime change, is that even the objective anymore? And also, is there a possibility of that ever happening without US boots on ground? And if not, then what would history really remember the objective of this war as?
That's a point, and my concern is that what the US attacks this time, since 2026, has been for regime change in the countries where it is attacking. And this can actually be interpreted very differently by China. Because if the US government is attacking not just as a war, but as that I want regime change, obviously, I mean, any war always includes that sort of a phenomena. But even what happened in Venezuela and other places, it's a different sort of global map, a global architecture of security that USA is trying to say that if you are with me, I'll ensure that your regime stays in place. If you're not with me, I will change the regime. Remember, the regime change is something China has always been very against.
Yeah.
That one should not interfere in the internal affairs of any country.
Yeah.
Peace should be at their terms. It should not be a regime change. President Trump is actually overthrowing that rule book. So I don't think he is, it could, of course, I mean, these things change over time. It could happen that we lead to a more peaceful situation. But remember, Iran is not a country, is not a soft state in that way. It has got a long history. It's a country which has lived through a lot of privations.
Yeah.
Even if there's a more friendly regime in Iran with the USA, that doesn't necessarily mean that Iran will actually be less of a thorn for USA.
Sure.
Since 1979, when the hostage crisis happened, till now, Iran has waged a very long war against US interests. That takes a lot of doing. And to help and to ensure that it's a collective memory. So people don't necessarily in Iran become all of a sudden, I mean, even if say IRGC is dismantled, the Iranian architecture of terror is dismantled, that architecture doesn't get wiped out. It exists from other countries. So essentially, I mean, look at it. USA, despite all its powers, has not been able to suppress the Houthis.
Correct.
The Houthis have become a very major problem in West Asia.
Yeah.
So we create more area panels of disturbance in West Asia than what was, say, 5 days ago. So I suspect this is not something that is going to be looking very happy just because the war ends and Iran says, okay, fine, we return to the negotiating table, take nuclear off the discussions.
Right.
This is something which is going to have ramifications. Whether that affects the economic conditions globally, no, yes, certainly I do agree that Iran has very limited ability to damage basic economic structure. But it does create problems for countries like India in terms of the what will be the challenges of navigation along this critical sea route.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay. Barney, final question to you. What next from US President Donald Trump? Because he's been making good on all his military commitments, be it Venezuela or Iran. Is Greenland next?
No, I don't think Greenland's next. I think even if you look at the Iran war, I think once you're within the conflict, goalposts change. I think the Americans are already quietly changing goalposts from regime change to dismantling military to dismantling nuclear arsenal. I think we have to remember that this is something which also comes on the backdrop of severe domestic challenges the president is facing. So again, whatever motivations for the conflict, we can set that aside. But I think this may be the end of international adventurism for the Americans, at least for this year, because this has created far more complexity. And as people are seeing, right, it's a far broader conflict than everyone anticipated, and it's going to be far more intense and last longer. In fact, the president 48 hours back mentioned that he expected the conflict to to complete within 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Now setting expectations of 3 months.
Yeah.
We've seen in the case of Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq that these wars. So again, I think this is something we can debate whether this was needed at the right time. But to be fair to both the Americans and the Israelis, they found an Iranian administration at its weakest point in the last 20-25 years, right? And I think moving against them may have made strategic sense at this point of time. But again, I don't believe that there'll be any more unilateral transgressions by the Americans or anyone else, right? Till this war at least settles down, which it seems will take not weeks but months as we move forward.
All right, let's leave it at that for this morning. Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, author contributing editor, Business Standard, and Barnik Chitran Mehta, P investor, managing partner, Chrysalis Equity. Thank you so much for your time. And with that, we will slip into a very short break. When we come back, we continue with our coverage of the latest on the flare-up in West Asia. Keep watching News 9.
इन्होंने हेल्थ इंश्योरेंस नहीं लिया और हॉस्पिटल्स के लाखों के बिल चुकाने में अपनी सारी सेविंग्स गवा दी। और इन्होंने पॉलिसी बाजार से हेल्थ इंश्योरेंस लिया, जेब से एक भी पैसा खर्च नहीं हुआ और पॉलिसी बाजार ने कैशलेस क्लेम दिलवाने में इनको पूरा सपोर्ट किया। तो रिस्क मत लो, पॉलिसी बाजार से 1 करोड़ का हेल्थ इंश्योरेंस सिर्फ 525 रुपए महीने से शुरू।
रश्मि, ये मैडम बड़े शहर से छोटे शहर बसने जा रही है, बताओ। छोटे छोटे शहरों में ही तो है बड़े बड़े अखाड़े, नए नए दावपेच सीखेगी और फ्यूचर में मेडल जीतेगी। पर बेटा, इनका फ्यूचर?
बड़े पापा, SBI लाइफ से इनका फ्यूचर सिक्योर है।
अभी तो इसकी जीत का इरादा पक्का है। करो पूरे अपने इरादे, अपनों से किए सभी वादे। SBI लाइफ अपने लिए, अपनों के लिए।
Welcome back. You're watching Morning Brief at 9. We continue our coverage of the war in West Asia. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has expressed deep concern over the escalating situation in West Asia. The Prime Minister said the current developments are a matter of serious concern for India, especially given the large number of Indian nationals living and working across the region. He reiterated that India supports the resolution of all disputes through dialogue and diplomacy, calling for restraint and de-escalation. Listen in.
पश्चिम एशिया की वर्तमान स्थिति हमारे लिए गहरी चिंता का विषय है। भारत डायलॉग और डिप्लोमेसी के माध्यम से सभी विवादों का समाधान का समर्थन करता है। इस क्षेत्र में मौजूद सभी भारतीय नागरिकों की सुरक्षा के लिए हम सभी देशों के साथ मिलकर काम करते रहेंगे।
Yeah. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi also held a telephonic conversation with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud. Now, during the call, Prime Minister Modi strongly condemned the recent attacks on Saudi Arabia, calling them a violation of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The two leaders discussed the evolving situation in West Asia and stressed the urgent need to restore regional peace and stability at the earliest. In a post on X, Prime Minister Modi thanked the Crown Prince for ensuring the safety and well-being of the Indian community during these difficult times. Meanwhile, flights in and out of major West Asian nations have been disrupted for a third straight day after US and Israeli strikes on Iran triggered widespread airspace closures across the Gulf, including at Dubai, Doha and Abu Dhabi, leaving tens of thousands of passengers in limbo. Take a look.
Tens of thousands of travelers across the Middle East, including James Gaskin here in Dubai, were in limbo Monday after an escalating conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran disrupted flights worldwide.
You can feel today there's a bit more anxiety, I think is the best description. There's a lot more people in reception, asking questions, trying to find out what the latest is. It just feels as if people are now, right, this is real and I don't really like it.
After a week in India for work, the 53-year-old procurement manager from Northern England was already short of clean clothes when his connecting flight to Britain was cancelled on Saturday. He was taken to a local hotel with hundreds of other passengers.
When we were in the lobby, I think the other hotel got hit by the missile, and we thought a bus had actually hit the hotel because you could feel the shockwave from the missile, and it felt like a vehicle had hit our hotel, and we were how many miles away.
British friends Julie Hardy and Francis McKay, who had been on a 2-week tour of southern India, were staying at the same low-rise hotel near the airport.
We had the incident on the first night where the alarm went off on our mobile phones. Get downstairs now.
Twice, and that was very frightening for us because we're not used to that sort of thing.
So we did, and Julie went downstairs in her nightie.
Yeah, I did. Nobody took a blind bit of notice. Everyone was walking past as though I was invisible.
Dubai, the world's busiest international hub, handles more than 1,000 flights a day. Tourist Anthony Broadbent told Reuters he didn't know whether to stay put or attempt to leave.
We and everybody else who's still here, which is the vast majority of people, all want to get out at the same time. It's not obvious what we should do, but at the moment, on balance, we've decided to stay put.
Escalating conflict in the Middle East has laid bare how heavily global air travel relies on a handful of hubs led by Dubai. After the shutdown of Gulf airspace rippled quickly across airline networks worldwide, Dubai stands as the center of a global network spanning 110 nations and 454,000 flights a year, and it now has the momentous task of piecing its network back together.
Meanwhile, amid continued flight disruptions across the Gulf, the Indian government has announced special relief operations to bring stranded passengers back home. Indigo will operate 10 special relief flights from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia to India today, subject to necessary approvals and prevailing airspace conditions. The airline is coordinating closely with the Consulate General of India in Jeddah to facilitate passenger movement. At the same time, Air India Express will resume services to Muscat, Oman, operating 6 flights from various Indian cities. The relief measures come after escalating tensions between Iran and Israel led several Gulf countries to temporarily close or restrict their airspace, stranding thousands of travelers, including many Indians. The Ministry of Civil Aviation in India says it is closely monitoring the evolving situation and working with airlines, foreign aviation authorities and Indian missions abroad to ensure safe and orderly passenger movement. Moreover, passengers have been advised to check flight status directly with airlines and rely only on official sources for updates. Moving on now, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has presented a strikingly new narrative of how the Iran conflict started, saying that the United States attacked Tehran only after learning that ally Israel was set to strike the country. He claims Tehran was set to target U.S. forces in retaliation, prompting President Donald Trump to act preemptively alongside Israel. Now, having said that, Rubio stressed that while the U.S. has built up military assets in the region, it is not currently planning to deploy ground troops, though that option remains on the table.
The President always has the options to undertake whatever operations he decides to do as the Commander-in-Chief. That said, we believe the objective that we have set for this mission, which is the destruction of their ballistic missile capabilities, both launch capability and manufacturing, can be achieved without ground forces. Right now, we're not postured for ground forces, but obviously the President has those options.
The Secretary of State Marco Rubio also added that while Washington hopes the Iranian people will ultimately topple the current government, the immediate objective is only to dismantle Iran's ballistic missile capabilities and ensure it cannot obtain a nuclear weapon. Listen in.
We hope that the Iranian people can overthrow this government and establish a new future for that country. We would love for that to be possible. But the objective of this mission is the destruction of their ballistic missile capabilities and of their naval capabilities.
And amid soaring oil prices, Marco Rubio also said the administration will act to contain energy market fallout from the conflict. He said Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Energy Secretary Chris Wright will outline steps to address rising fuel costs soon.
What's your message to Americans who are concerned about rising energy prices given the spiking of oil prices today?
Yes, and we knew that going in would be a factor, and so we have a program in place that will begin to be implemented by Secretary Wright, Secretary Bessent. We talked about it last night, again, about this program. We talked this morning, and starting tomorrow you will see us rolling out those phases to try to mitigate against that. Obviously, markets are going to be reacting to news about what's happening. And again, a reminder, think about it, okay? This terroristic regime, led by radical clerics, has the ability, potentially, to shut off 20% of global energy. That's the kind of leverage they have because of their Navy. We're going to destroy their Navy.
Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says military operations against Iran are not intended to spiral into a prolonged conflict. However, he acknowledged that achieving U.S. objectives will take time. Hegseth outlined those objectives in military terms, saying the Pentagon aims to dismantle Iran's navy and degrade its extensive missile capabilities. He said those systems could otherwise shield any future covert attempts by Tehran to develop a nuclear weapon, a claim Iran continues to deny for all these years.
This is not a so-called regime change war, but the regime sure did change, and the world is better off for it. The mission of Operation Epic Fury is laser-focused. Destroy Iranian offensive missiles, destroy Iranian missile production, destroy their navy and other security infrastructure, and they will never have nuclear weapons. This is not Iraq. This is not endless. I was there for both.
And UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has now agreed to give the US access to British air bases for conducting ongoing operations in Iran. The move follows criticism from President Donald Trump, who said London took too long to grant access during the initial round of airstrikes. Britain had declined to support the first wave of US attacks on Tehran, but Starmer now says allowing base access is necessary to prevent Iran from firing missiles across the region.
Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom was not involved in the initial strikes on Iran by the US and Israel. That decision was deliberate. We believe that the best way forward for the region and for the world is a negotiated settlement. President Trump has expressed his disagreement with our decision not to get involved in the initial strikes. But it is my duty to judge what is in Britain's national interest. That is what I've done, and I stand by it. The only way to stop the threat is to destroy the missiles at source, in their storage depots or at the launchers. The US requested permission to use British bases for that specific and limited defensive purpose because they have the capabilities to do so. Yesterday evening, we took the decision to accept that new request in order to prevent Iran firing missiles across the region.
And addressing the United Nations in New York, Iran's ambassador to the UN, Amir Saeed Iravani, insisted there was no imminent threat from Iran and described Tehran's nuclear program as exclusively peaceful. He said Iran was engaged in serious diplomatic negotiations and accused the United States of choosing military force over dialogue for the second time in violation of the UN Charter. Listen in.
Let's make no mistake, there was no imminent threat from Iran. Our nuclear program is exclusively peaceful. We were engaged in serious diplomatic negotiations. For the second time, the United States chose force over diplomacy and violated the Charter. There are no legal grounds that justify this attack. The so-called preemptive attack has no basis in international law. The prohibition on the use of force is absolute, except in self-defense against an armed attack. Iran is exercising its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter. Our response is lawful, necessary, and proportionate.
And the widening Iran conflict is now rattling global shipping and insurance markets. Insurance companies are cancelling war risk coverage for vessels operating in the Gulf as hostilities escalate. At least 4 tankers have been damaged, 2 seafarers killed, and roughly 150 ships remain stranded near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical maritime choke points.
Shipping in the Gulf has been disrupted as the widening Iran conflict has left at least 4 tankers damaged, 2 seafarers killed, and 150 ships stranded around the Strait of Hormuz. The strait between Iran and Oman carries around 1/5 of oil consumed globally, as well as large quantities of gas. Vessels in the area were hit as Iran retaliated to US and Israeli strikes. Fears of a prolonged closure have caused oil and European natural gas prices to jump. Brent crude futures were up more than 8% as the conflict triggered multiple oil and gas shutdowns in the Middle East. Shipping data showed at least 150 vessels had dropped anchor in the strait and surrounding waters on Sunday. Iran has said it closed navigation through the critical waterway, prompting key buyers such as Asian governments and refiners to assess oil stockpiles. A US-flagged products tanker was damaged by aerial impacts while berthed in the Gulf, the vessel's owner said in a statement. A projectile also hit a Marshall Islands-flagged product tanker, killing a crew member as the vessel sailed off the coast of Oman, its manager said. As a result, marine insurers are cancelling war risk coverage for Iranian, the Gulf and adjacent waters, according to notices. Ship owners are also deterred from sending vessels to the region, sources and analysts said. Meanwhile, the market will need more ships to load crude from the US and West Africa, a source from a shipping company said.
And the Iran conflict is now impacting tech infrastructure as well in the Gulf. Amazon's cloud facilities in the UAE faced power and connectivity issues after an unidentified object struck its data center. The incident coincided with Iran launching drones and missiles across the region in retaliation for US and Israeli strikes.
Amazon could be facing outages because of airstrikes happening across the Middle East. Here in Dubai Sunday, smoke billowed into the sky over a port which the government media office said caught on fire because of debris resulting from an aerial interception. Amazon said Monday its cloud computing facilities in the Middle East face power and connectivity issues after what it called unidentified objects struck its data center in the United Arab Emirates. The incident happened on the same day Iran fired a barrage of drones and missiles at Gulf states in retaliation for U.S. and Israeli strikes that killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The quote objects triggered a fire on Sunday that forced authorities to eventually cut power to 2 clusters of Amazon data centers in the UAE, with restoration expected to take at least a day, according to Amazon Web Services status page. Localized power issues impacted AWS services in both the UAE and neighboring Bahrain, according to the page. A strike, if confirmed on the AWS facility in the UAE, would mark the first time a major U.S. tech company's data center has been knocked offline by military action. It could also raise questions around big tech's pace of expansion in the region. U.S. tech giants have been positioning the UAE as a regional hub for artificial intelligence computing needed to power services such as ChatGPT. A Washington-based think tank said last week that data centers could become targets like oil facilities have been for decades. Shares of Amazon were lower in Monday morning trading.
And with that, we will slip into another very short break. But when we come back, we'll bring you the latest updates from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's first official visit to India, which just concluded. We'll bring you that and more on the other side of the break. You're watching Morning Brief at 9 right here on News 9.
नितेश श्रीवास्तव जी सिर्फ 35 साल की उम्र में अचानक एक बीमारी से चले गए। उनकी टर्म लाइफ इंश्योरेंस के पैसे बच्चों की पढ़ाई और घर खर्च में काम आ सकते हैं। पॉलिसी बाजार ने क्लेम के वक्त फैमिली का पूरा साथ दिया। पॉलिसी बाजार पे 2 करोड़ का टर्म लाइफ इंश्योरेंस सिर्फ 700 रुपए महीने से शुरू।
It's confirmed. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been eliminated. But it was just not about Khamenei. It was also about the entire regime which the Americans wanted to take out.
Are the Iranians going to carry out their pledges and are they going to continue with their attack?
Though Trump had said that the waves of attack would continue, but a new signal has come that there might be a small pause.
IRGC is likely to adopt lesser radical and more pragmatic approach to basically buy time so that the regime can survive.
There is much more than what is visible or to the naked eye.
Khamenei was killed because uranium enrichment and the Iranian desire to make a bomb.
That expertise is there. People know how to enrich it. There are infrastructure which can again be rebuilt.
Iran today is headless. There is transition, but conclusion is far away.
Welcome back. You're watching News 9. This is Morning Brief at 9. After 3 years, nearly 3 years of diplomatic tensions, India and Canada have taken a major step towards restoring their relationship as leaders from both countries unveiled a wide-ranging set of measures aimed at deepening economic cooperation. Among the agreements is a long-term uranium supply deal, which, according to experts, will boost India's energy security as it comes under pressure from the US. Now, both sides also plan to collaborate on smaller modular reactors and advanced nuclear technologies. Now, speaking in New Delhi during his first visit to India, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said the two sides are committed to finalizing a comprehensive economic partnership. Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said India and Canada are targeting bilateral trade of $50 billion by the year 2030, up from nearly $9 billion in 2024-25. The two sides have already agreed on the terms of reference for the proposed trade pact.
रक्षा और सुरक्षा के क्षेत्र में बढ़ता सहयोग हमारे गहरे आपसी विश्वास और संबंधों की मैच्योरिटी का प्रतीक है। हम डिफेंस इंडस्ट्रीज, मैरीटाइम डोमेन अवेयरनेस और मिलिट्री एक्सचेंजेज बढ़ाने पर काम करेंगे। इसी उद्देश्य से आज हमने इंडिया कनाडा डिफेंस डायलॉग की स्थापना करने का निर्णय लिया है।
And our partnerships will be reinforced by the strong foundations we are building in trade and defense. We're advancing towards a Canada-India comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the aim to conclude by the end of this year. This ambitious agreement will reduce barriers, increase certainty, unlock opportunity for exporters, investors, and workers in both our countries with the aim to double trade by the end of this decade. In the last decade, let's just reflect on what's happened. In the last decade, under your leadership, Prime Minister, India has become the fastest growing economy in the world. Per capita incomes in this country have risen at a pace never seen in history, seldom in human history. the most ambitious projects in clean energy, in the digital economy, in biofuels, in the next generation of artificial intelligence talent are all here in India. Prime Minister, Canada shares such ambition and your sense of purpose.
And with that, we come to an end of this edition of Morning Brief at 9. Thank you so much for watching. News continues right here on News 9 after this very short break.
News 9, always on point, no noise.
How the Dragon is leveraging US tariff pressure to rewrite World Trade Order. Beijing aims global dominance.
That was a very strong attack.
Only sharp, powerful insights that matter to you. Stories that are unmissable.
No more tolerance to unruly passengers on Indian flights.
In your interest.
This edition of In Your Interest.
Every time. Fastest alerts, hard facts, nuanced 360-degree analysis. India's largest news network. From the Northeast to the far South, we reach every corner. From breaking stories to in-depth reporting, when the world changes, News 9 leads from the front. News 9, on top, always.
It's confirmed. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been eliminated. But it was just not about Khamenei. It was also about the entire regime which the Americans wanted to take out.
Are the Iranians going to carry out